Hi, my name's David Daniel. It's the morning of May 25th, Memorial Day. I just wanted to introduce myself and start going through Chapter 1. I'm not going to subject you to this video the whole time. I just thought I'd show you a quick shot of what I look like so you'll recognize me next week. Just a quick introduction to myself. Well, first, let's do this. Sorry, this will be very informal, so excuse me if I make some mistakes. I'm recording it live and probably just do it once, so if I mess up, I'll just go back, just like if I was in front of you in the class. So, this is Humanities 1101, Introduction to Humanities. I'm teaching 2 courses this summer of Humanities 1101. You're either in 61-295 or 61-296. 61-295 meets on Mondays from 11:30 to 2, and 61-296 meets on Mondays from 2 to 4:30. If for some reason you can't attend the class you're scheduled for, you're always welcome to the alternative class, but those are the only 2 alternatives that are offered this summer by me. Both classes will meet in room 916 at Building 100. Again, my name's David Daniel. Here's my email address. At this point in time, you should have all received an email from me. Next week, when we meet in person, I'll have a sign-up sheet. So if you have an email address that you prefer to use other than your Gwinnett Tech email address, you'll have an opportunity to give it to me then. But official correspondence will always come from the school to that email, to your Gwinnett Tech email address. So I suggest you set it up to where that forwards, but whatever your preference. So again, sorry about that. Introduction to me. I can tell you more about myself, and hopefully we'll get to know each other as the quick summer semester goes by. But just so you know a little background information about me, this is what I do for a living. Being an adjunct professor at Gwinnett Tech does not pay the bills. I own a company with a guy in California called Bonafide Iron. We buy and resell heavy construction equipment and cranes. As you can see, I'm the big guy on the right. Chris is the guy on the left. If you want to read more of my bio and look at our website, you're welcome to do so. It's pretty simple, bonafideiron.com. But I do travel extensively as part of my work because we buy equipment all over the world and resell equipment all over the world. So that's why I have my classes on Mondays, so I can spend the rest of the week traveling if I need to. I'm married. I have 3 children. We live in Athens, Georgia, so I commute over to Gwinnett for this class. And yeah, that's about it. I think you'll get to know more about me as we go through the course. So the disadvantage of doing this over the internet today is that it's an important day for introducing the course and the way that you're going to get points. The advantage is it makes it a little bit easier for me to show you how to access and make sure you're accomplishing some of this stuff. So if you've got any questions, obviously you can email them to me or you can simply write them down, and we'll spend a few minutes next Monday going through answering questions and covering some of this again. The advantage of me doing this online is that I have proof that I told you this stuff, because it's going to come later on in the class and you're going to go, oh, I didn't know I had to do that or this. So I want to make sure you understand that there are requirements. All right, so the best thing to keep in mind about this course is that it is time consuming, but it is not difficult. You will have a lot of work to do, especially given this fact that it's summer semester. So it's going to consume a lot of time. If you're not prepared to devote a lot of time to the class, I suggest you re-enroll in one of the online online courses where you can get a little bit more time to complete the projects, or excuse me, I'm yawning, it's early, or you can reschedule for fall or spring, possibly when you also have more time. This is a condensed version of the class, but the assignments, the expectations are the same. We'll meet for much longer, and you'll have a lot less number of days to squeeze in all of the assignments, and we'll talk about what those are here in a minute. First, the book, the textbook's Discovering the Humanities. It's packaged with the My Arts Lab in the bookstore. It is possible to buy the My Arts Lab through Angel, and I'll show you that in a minute when we pull up Angel. But you have to have the book, and the book is an absolute requirement for this course. You will not be able to do the daily quizzes. You will not be able to do the preparation for the midterm. You will not even be able to do the final virtual museum project without the textbook. So if you don't have the textbook, the best way to get it is packaged with the My Arts Lab in the bookstore. That way you don't have to pay for two different things. Even if you can find Discovering the Humanities really cheap on Amazon, you will be better off in the end purchasing it packaged as it is in the bookstore. The primary expectation of this class, the primary venue for this class is Angel. All of you are familiar with Angel, but we'll look at the specific course. Everything is completed within Angel. This is a hybrid course. That means we meet once a week, but the expectation is that you're working through the majority of the course over the internet through Angel. In a very few weeks, we will have the midterm. The midterm will count for 20% of your final grade. At the end of the course, the final project will be due. That's called the Virtual Museum Project. We'll talk about that. So let's look at the syllabus real quick. The syllabus has been emailed to you. It is also in Angel, and I'll show you where in Angel if you haven't gotten the email or you haven't checked the email. But we're not going to read through the syllabus. You're all adults, or at least old enough to be able to read through the syllabus on your own. But there are a few highlights. So the course description, we'll get into that. We'll get into chapter 1 this morning. But the course description explores the philosophic and artistic heritage of humanity expressed through an historical perspective on visual arts, music, and literature. The Humanities provides insight into people and society. Topics include historical and cultural developments, contributions of the humanities, and research. I talked about the required textbook. Methods of instruction. The course will be presented through lectures, discussions, audio-visual materials, class or laboratory projects, daily assignments, written projects, written reports, prepared speeches, library assignments, field trips, guest speakers, and tests and quizzes. Attendance in this class is absolutely required. The way that it's calculated is students must attend 80% of class meetings. What that means is that if you miss one course, if you miss one lecture, if you miss one class during the summer, you will have missed 20% of our class meetings, or pretty close to it. So that means basically you have 2 absences. After 2 absences, I will attempt to communicate with you. If I'm either not communicated with in return, or I'm not satisfied as to why you were absent, I will administratively withdraw you from the course. If you don't want to come to class, don't register for a class that requires attendance. Register for one of the online classes. It's plain and simple. There's a lot more online versions of this available than there are hybrid courses, so My guess is that you've registered for this course because you want to come to class because it's helpful for you to learn, and therefore you have to attend. Um, the midterm exam must be taken. If you don't take the midterm, you don't pass the course. It doesn't matter if you got all the points you needed to get a C. If you don't take the midterm, you'll be withdrawn from the course. As you can see by the breakdown here, the final project, we'll talk about this a little bit and then more as we get further into it, is the virtual museum project. It counts for 30% of your grade. This is in lieu of a final exam, so if you don't like retention type grades, the only retention grade is a midterm exam. But the final project will be 30%, midterm 20%, quizzes 16.5, daily assignments, etc. Basically, this course is based on points. So if you look here, the grading system is a point system with the following breakdown: 900 to 1,000 points as an A, etc. And I'll show you how you're going to get your points. So the rest of this is probably stuff you've seen on all your other syllabi and your other courses. So I don't think we need to look at that anymore. Much more relevant to our course, this is the schedule and points document that I emailed you also and is also available in Angel. This provides a very detailed list of exactly what you have to do, when you have to do it, and how many points you're going to get for doing it. You could even keep up with it yourself. So, print this out or save it, and you can fill it out as you go along, and you'll know exactly how many points you're getting. Remember, this course goes very, very quickly. I think the last day we meet, and I also did a calendar, will be July 6th. When we first get together, it'll be June 1st. So basically, we'll have 5 weeks together. 6, technically. So, moves quickly. After listening to me go on and on today, I strongly suggest you get going immediately. The first thing due will be the field trip waiver and assignment agreement. This is basically proof that you are actually attending the course. If I don't receive this by tomorrow, then I'll have to report you as a no-show. So that gives you some indication of how quickly we're needing to move here. Chapter 1 quizzes will typically be due on the day that we cover the chapter, the intention being that you're prepared and ready to discuss the chapter, not just listen to me talk about it. In this case, it's due day after tomorrow on the 27th. Remember, all chapter quizzes are open book. We'll go over that again when we look at Angel a little bit. MAL stands for My Arts Lab. My Arts Lab Chapter 1. Both of these are due day after tomorrow. And then over here on this page, you'll see bonus assignments. The bonus assignments are purely optional. They give you a potential 110 extra points. They are scheduled. So you won't be able to wait until July 1st to decide, oh, I need 50 extra points. I'm going to go back and do all these extras. They won't be available then. All right, a few of them will, but most of them will not be available. If you want to be sure to get an A in this class, or if you just want to be careful because you're not confident on your preparations for the midterm, or you don't like doing public speaking projects and you're worried you might not do a good job on the virtual museum project, for whatever reason, if you think you want to do bonus assignments, then you need to do them on schedule. The other reason to do the bonus assignment, aside from points, is preparation. So for units 1 through 3, these units, all this stuff's going to be on the midterm. So why not do it? It'll help you retain it and prepare. So In addition to the MyArts Labs assignment, there's a work ethics quiz and a cyber plagiarism quiz. I strongly suggest you do these since they're both worth 15 points each. The cyber plagiarism quiz will be due fairly quickly, and the reason for that is in preparation for some of the writing that you need to do. I don't think we need to read through all of these, but I do want to highlight a few things. Field trip plan. This is where you come up with a plan on when and what you're going to do. This is really important to get done right away because a lot of opportunities are going to start disappearing as the summer wears on. Sculpture and architecture photos, we'll talk about that as it gets closer, but that'll be next week. Sculpture and architecture essay, we'll also talk about this next week. It's going to be important that you employ your writing and citation skills very early on, as much to get a good grade on this as to prove you know how to do it in preparation for the virtual museum project. I keep mentioning this, part 1, and the virtual museum project, part 2. Midterm will be on the 22nd. June 22nd. And other things worth noting, museum field trip assignment, June 19th. Live performance report, also June 19th. I already highlighted virtual museum project and virtual museum project. These are your big points, right? 200 points for virtual museum project part 2, as much as your midterm. All right. Again, we're going to look at Angel right now, and we can talk about this if you've got questions next Monday. I also provided a different format. I know some people prefer like a schedule on a calendar. This was also emailed to you. It is also in important documents in Angel. So today is the 25th. There's no class because of Memorial Day, except for what we're doing right now. But notice, just like we talked about before, field trip waivers due tomorrow, MyArts Lab. I know this is kind of small, but obviously you can make it larger or print it out. So, and this gives you just sort of an overview. And then this is our last day together. So, goes very, very quickly. Sorry, let's do this. Let's open up Angel. So my assumption is everyone in the class is familiar with Angel because there is at least one prerequisite for this course. If you aren't, it's fairly self-explanatory. If you're in 61-295, you're going to go in here. Obviously, if you're in 61-296, you'd go in the other. They're identical, so we're just going to look at 61-295. There's a lot of useful stuff up here, but honestly, 95% plus of the time, you just need to be clicking on lessons. Everything is within lessons, okay? So it's roughly arranged by schedule due dates, but it's also arranged within units. So, for example, we'll start with the very first thing that's due, field trip waiver and attendant and assignment submission policy. You'll simply go through, you'll download this, you'll be expected to sign it, and then you'll submit that. Looks like a lot of you have already done it. Very good. So, MyArts Lab, this goes to the publisher, so you can use it to register your code that you hopefully got from the book, or there is an option within here how to purchase it, and you'll have to just read through that. I don't remember exactly how to do it, but it's in there somewhere. Important documents, you've heard me mention this a few times. The syllabus is here. Errors in the textbook. This will become important at one point, but I'll talk about that later. Introduction letter, emailed to you, scheduling points, emailed to you, summer calendar. We've looked at these two documents and the syllabus. Unit 1. Okay, so everything's sort of embedded in here, right, in each unit. So you click on Unit 1. Um, this is your study guide and quiz. So you'll go in here to complete the quiz. Keep in mind, all quizzes are open book, but they are also timed. So be ready. Don't expect to be able to read through all of these and answer them by looking at the book in the time allotted without some advanced preparation. Ideally, of course, the advanced preparation is that you've read the book or read the chapter. The point of this course, obviously, most of you are taking it because you have to. I understand that. But we want you to learn, and so you do need to be reading. Especially for the midterm, you have these study guides which you can download. Those I strongly suggest you download and bring with you to class especially before the midterm, as we prepare for the midterm, and you can just take your notes directly onto those study guides. Again, within the units, you will find everything. So here's the quiz, study guide. Here's the My Arts Lab assignment. So you'll go through these. These 2 are required. These 3 are bonuses. Here's your field trip plan, sculpture and architecture assignment, etc. Now, the thing you need to remember to be successful in this course is to read. From the beginning of the syllabus to the end of the syllabus to the chapters to the descriptions of what's expected in each assignment, you must read this information. Do not click on Photo Dropbox, submit some random pictures that you think are correct, get a bad grade, and then email me and say, Mr. Daniel, Professor Daniel, David, whatever you want to call me, I didn't get a very good grade on this. Because all I'm going to do is say, did you read the assignment description? And you'll say, yeah, I read it. But it's laid out very clearly. The people who put this course together spent a lot of time being very, very thorough on exactly what to do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Read. You must read, read, read. Also, within each unit, you can actually download, if you like audiobooks, download it, listen to it. That's fine. That'll help. Or read it, e-text. So all those options are available within Angel. Click on one more. Again, study guide and quizzes, My Arts Lab assignments, study guides and quizzes, museum field trip. So you'll see that all of these assignments are within each lesson. You must look at each lesson. So for example, to find the museum field trip assignment, you're going to go into Unit 2. See here it says Unit 2. To find the Chapter 7 quiz, you're going to go into Unit 3. To find the live performance report, you're going to go into Unit 3, etc. So everything, again, last time, everything is within the units, within the lessons. So lesson, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, etc. There's 6 units. The exception to that would be the work ethics quiz, which is found within the work ethics folder, and the Penn State Cyber Plagiarism quiz, which is found in the MLA style guide. All right, again, if you got any questions, ask. Communicating with me through Angel is fine, but you're not going to get communication back through Angel. I have Angel set up to automatically forward to my email address, the one I gave you at the beginning of the class, and I'm going to reply to you via email. So I don't mind if you communicate with me through Angel, just don't expect me to communicate back through Angel. My communication will come to your email address. So email address is very important. If class is canceled for some reason, which could happen, hopefully won't in such a short time period as this, but if it were, you will get an email telling you it's canceled. So if you show up to class looking around and you don't see anybody there and you're confused, open your email. All right, let's close out Angel and let's go through chapter 1. Trying to think if there's anything I didn't cover. I don't think so. All right. One second here and we'll get started. So, getting started in a discussion of the humanities over basically all of time, all of known history, is going to require us to cover a lot of time periods or a lot of time. At first, it'll go very quickly, and then as we get into some of the more familiar historical cultures, things will slow down a lot. Um, but to talk about some of the time periods, especially the more ancient time periods, we need to know the distinction between BC and CE or BC and AD. Basically, I don't know when or exactly why, but at some point, historians switched from using BC to BCE um, to designate time periods. So, for example, if I wanted to say uh, we think so and so lived 10,000 years BC, then I would be saying exactly the same thing as if I said we think so and so lived 10,000 years ago BCE. The difference is they stand for two different things. BCE stands for before Common Era, and BC stands for before Christ. So presumably the transition from BC to BCE has something to do with political correctness. The same goes for CE and AD. As you might imagine, CE stands for Common Era. I often ask people in class what AD stands for. My guess is that most of you just said after death, which could be right, but isn't. AD stands for Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. So even a little more unpolitically correct than before Christ. So we are currently in the year 2015 AD, or we're currently in the year 2015 CE. Same year, just different designations. So 3 of the big time periods that we're going to cover very quickly are the Paleolithic or Stone Age, the Neolithic Age, and then the Bronze and Iron Age. As we get into the Bronze and Iron Age, and even the tail end of the Neolithic Age, we'll start getting into historic cultures that you probably will recognize. Plus, we know a lot more about those time periods, and things that were made or written still exist. Whereas from 10,000 BCE, we don't have a lot of stuff left over. So this is our very first painting. It's not quite the oldest actually, but it is the first one that we're going to talk about. It's entitled Wall Painting with Bird-Headed Man, Bison, and Rhinoceros. They date this back to 15,000 to 13,000 BCE. Um, if you want to know how many years ago that was, you would simply take 15,000 BCE and you would add it to the current year, 2015. So it's 17,015 years ago. Obviously, we don't know exactly when this was painted since a gap of 2,000 years was given. So, and that'll be common for a lot of this older stuff. Um, Several things to notice about this painting in particular. First, we'll start with how we designate the paintings. All works of art in this class will be designated with a title. Wall painting with bird-headed man, bison, and rhinoceros is this particular title. The location, Le Sceau Cave in Dordogne, France. Sometimes it's going to be really specific, sometimes it's going to be more general. The time period, and then the medium. A lot of people get hung up on the medium. The medium in this case is the paint on limestone cave wall, and the size. Size is important, especially since we're looking at pictures. So, I mean, it gives you an idea of the scale. I mean, this is approximately 9 feet long. So from here to here is 9 feet. So that gives you a better idea of scale. So title, location, time period, and medium, and size. You should find those on just about every painting or sculpture or whatever. Now, what's missing from this one, of course, is the artist. So a lot of times we don't know who painted this clearly. A lot of times the artist in these older time periods won't be known, and when it is known, we'll be putting it down here. If it's unknown, then typically we'll talk about a culture, but in this particular case, we don't really even know what culture other than Paleolithic culture. So looking at this painting, there are several things we'll talk about. If you just want to keep in mind, generally this is a rhinoceros. If you didn't know, mostly the back end of one, but you can see the head here. This is a bison. This is a man, presumably with a bird-headed mask. We can say man, if you notice anatomically, that is a man. This is a spear that presumably has just, or at some point, hit the bison. And this, which most people probably won't recognize, is a spear thrower, which would have been used very commonly to extend the distance that a spear could be thrown. The bird is simply decorative. The main part of the spear thrower is down here. You would notch the end of the spear here and then throw it. So we'll talk about some specifics about this painting, but first let's talk about the distinction between civilization and culture. A civilization is a social, economic, and political entity distinguished by the ability to express itself through images and written language. Culture encompasses the values and behaviors shared by a group of people developed over time and passed down from one generation to the next. So basically, the discussion of the humanities begins with civilization of some sort, because it requires the expression of ideas through images and written language. Cultures would be things that we'll talk about that are distinct to different groups of people. For example, Mesopotamian culture or Egyptian culture. And that'll develop extensively as we move forward. So the reason we mention that in between the painting and this question is we want to talk about Paleolithic culture. So remember, Paleolithic culture was the old 10,000 to 5,000 BCE culture. And we would like to know, after looking at this painting by a civilized people in a cave, what does it tell us? What does this tell us about the culture of the Paleolithic people? Um, there are some things that are pretty obvious that we know from the painting, but we also sort of can figure out just by thinking about them. Um, and then the next question is, what assumptions are we making that come from our culture? So we're 17,000, 15 years divorced from these people and what they valued. So obviously, we're going to have different understandings about the world. Paleolithic culture, for example, was exclusively made up of hunter gatherers, and what that means is um, they were typically nomadic, which means they never lived in one particular place for very long. They moved around, probably kind of like your picture of Native Americans, with um, teepees and constantly sort of moving about the country. They were hunter gatherers, which means that they didn't grow their food. They hunted it in the form of animals, or they gathered it in the form of fruit and vegetables. It was tribal in nature, which is sort of a loaded word, but typically means smaller, with one or two leaders that take a variety of different forms. Paleolithic means that they use stone tools. Okay, what that means is there's no metal at this point. They made spearheads out of stone, um, and they affixed them to wood. So very primitive technology, but technology nevertheless. Interestingly, one of the things about Paleolithic culture that we've learned from archaeological digs is that it seems like they always buried their dead. Now, of course, if they burned their dead, maybe there would be no evidence of that. So, but the point of saying they buried their dead is simply to say um, there was something about dying that was significant, and we'll see that that becomes obvious and clear in their art as we move forward. To go back to the painting, if you want to look at it in your textbook, um, there are a few things to note. The first one is what we call naturalism. This actually remains important for most of the time periods we'll discuss, with the exception actually of the modern time period when people really start to experiment, excuse me, experiment with other options. But naturalism is simply representations that imitate the actual appearance of the world as seen and experienced. So you'll notice that seems maybe even kind of silly and obvious to most of you, but when you start going to the museums, or when you pick a museum and go to it and you start walking through the different exhibits, you'll notice that at least half of them, if not more than half of them, have abandoned or modified or rebelled against this concept of naturalism, and have artists, I mean, have basically moved toward representing the world in different, often interesting and creative ways, often sort of off-putting and unusual ways. Um, but it's obvious when you see it, and for most of us, very kind of unsophisticated appreciators of artists like myself, it seems a little weird, because the whole point seems like you should be representing art in the way that the world actually appears. So there's a name for that, and it's called naturalism. Naturalism requires the use of perspectival drawing, which simply means you're conveying a sense of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. So again, if you go back to that cave wall, the cave wall is flat, it's two-dimensional. And yet, the artist manages to convey a three-dimensional space on it, especially with the rhinoceros and with the bison, less so with the human, which there's much speculation and discussion as to why that would be, but at the end of the day, it is a good example with the animals, especially of perspective drawing. This is actually the oldest piece that we'll talk about. This is a sculpture. Again, remember, we're looking for the title. You'll need to know this. So on the midterm exam, you will probably see a picture of this sculpture, and there will be a multiple choice question requiring you to identify its name. And its name is Venus of Willendorf, or you could just say woman. Woman Venus of Willendorf is the most thorough answer. It's found in Willendorf, Austria. Austria. Not Australia, Austria. Okay? Hopefully you know where Austria is. If you don't, look it up on Google Maps. You should know where Austria is. This is actually dated back to 24,000, 21,000 BCE. Again, a very large time period. It is limestone, and notice it's only 4 inches tall, so it's quite small. And there's speculation. Excuse me. Speculation is that these were small because they were carried around. Often, remember, these people were nomadic, so they didn't set up permanent cities, and so it wouldn't have made sense to have a real large sculpture that it was almost impossible to move around. And a lot of these have been found in the archaeological record. Their purpose is difficult to ascertain exactly, but we can assume a few things. But first, culturally speaking, do you find this Venus beautiful? It's possible that you do, interestingly enough, but most people don't. Just the anatomical exaggeration of the features, the way that the sculpture is made. The primary emphasis here is undoubtedly fertility, which would have clearly been of great value to Paleolithic people, since it meant an opportunity to survive with people to help hunting and gathering, but also to pass down their name. I mean, keep in mind the lifespan of most Paleolithic peoples would have been quite short, more than likely, 30 years probably. It's possible that the importance of the Venus of Willendorf figurine, which is found extensively in the archaeological record, indicates what's called matrilineal descent, which means that descent name is determined through the female line. So, for example, your last name, at this point in our culture, your last name is most likely from your father, which would make it patrilineal. It's not uncommon at all now to have your father and your mother, so it would be both patrilineal and matrilineal. And there are a few examples of people who have taken their mother's last name. So, but for the most part, our civilization, our culture, for a long time has been patrilineal. And like I said before, this is importance of fertility and importance of the family and the tribe. So we transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic. We get into agriculture. Basically, agriculture is when hunters and gatherers become farmers. Most of us know what farming is, or at least are dimly aware of the fact that when you buy a cabbage at the grocery store, it doesn't come from a manufacturing facility in some other part of the world, but in fact it's grown out of the ground. I hope you know that at least. 8,000 BCE, climate change allows for the gradual establishment of permanent cities, concentrated principally along permanent freshwater sources. So, one thing that I've failed to mention that is important is that most examples of civilized Paleolithic culture, and by that I mean Paleolithic culture that has produced works of art that we've discovered at least, were primarily or have been primarily found in the northern hemisphere. Um, for example, Venus of Willendorf is in Austria, not Australia, Austria, which is in Europe. Um, hopefully, you looked that up. If you didn't, I told you so. It was very cold. We know that it was extremely cold. Um, so not only did these peoples depend exclusively on gathering food and hunting food for their diet, but the climate probably would not have allowed for the establishment of agriculture. Not very easily, anyway. So, basically, as that changed, um, it became more and more possible to establish plots of land where you could grow food. And since you need water to do that, and because it requires a lot of stability, you start getting the development of cities. So, up until this point, we don't really have any cities. Notice that the word agriculture has the word culture in it. So again, it goes back to what we were talking about before. When you have a culture that is primarily based on farming, things change. Expressions of what is important change. The establishment of cities requires the innovations of architecture. A lot changed. And in the broadest sense, we still live in an agricultural society. That is a society that depends primarily for its food on growing it, and as a result has established permanent places to live. Um, so even though that may seem a little strange, comparing these old cultures and old cities to our cities, we are still agricultural. Um, so, for example, if for some reason, all these movies, apocalyptic movies and zombie movies, etc., but if for whatever reason we stopped being able to stock our grocery stores with food that's grown in South Georgia and South Carolina and the Midwest, um, people in Atlanta would starve to death. They, I mean, most of us would, right? Unless you're capable of growing your own food or have stocked a bunch of canned goods up, um, the the distance between having food and not having food is quite short, really. Um, so we're very much dependent on agriculture even today. But one of the things that also changes as you develop permanent cities um, and expressions of agriculture is pottery. Uh, Pottery is an extraordinarily impractical thing for nomadic tribal groups of people who are moving around. Why? Because it's very fragile. But as we start to see the rise of pottery as both a useful tool for holding water or liquid or making wine or whatever, um, we know that the peoples who are valuing this pottery so highly that they spend time um, decorating it is because we know it's permanent. We know it's not being moved around, which is why it's not being broken, etc. Um, so this is evidence from 5000 to 4000 BCE of a piece of pottery. Again, keep in mind its size, 11 and a quarter inches, so basically the size of a large drinking glass. Um, they call it a beaker with ibex dogs and long-necked birds. This is from southwest Iran. Um, just in case you don't know, this would be the ibex with the exaggerated horns. This is now notice, interestingly, um, this is not naturalism, right? So there are a few examples of things that are used. I mean, their ibexes didn't look like a geometric shape. This is non-naturalistic. The same with the dogs. I mean, they're exaggerated. The the excuse me, the long-necked birds, which you can't see the head of in the picture, their necks weren't that long, not even 5,000 years ago. So um, this is an interesting piece for a variety of reasons, excluding its departure from what I just said 10 minutes ago about naturalism. Also, with the development of cities and permanent locations, you start to get um, expressions of religion. And that's going to be one of the principal things that we have a lot of archaeological evidence for, uh, presumably simply because it was very important to the people in some shape or form. And so they built it out of materials that would last for thousands and thousands of years. This is an example which many of you have probably been exposed to in one shape, form, or another over the years, which is Stonehenge. Again, remember, we're going back to identifying. This doesn't give size, quite large. These are people. The picture is an aerial photograph for a reason. Um, but this is in England. It dates back to 2700 BCE or AD. And these are called megaliths. So megaliths are a very early architectural innovation which we'll see expressed in a variety of different ways, from simple designs like Stonehenge all the way up until we start seeing Greek temples being built, churches in the medieval ages, etc. So post and lintel is one of the most basic yet practical architectural elements. Notice the post is the vertical member and the lintel is the horizontal member. The idea simply being that the stones can hold up the weight. So here you have what's called breaking, if you know anything about carpentry. So you have the lintel is breaking midway on the post, and this lintel is breaking midway on the post. So you can create large large elements. Now, obviously, the culture that created Stonehenge and other megaliths did not have cranes or heavy equipment like I try to sell all the time. Um, and so there's a lot of mystery surrounding exactly how these stones were transported and erected. They were transported from great distances, actually. Um, a lot of time was put into these, and those sorts of speculations about how they were built will continue on into, really, we get to mechanical machinery, because a lot of stuff is, it's just difficult to imagine how they managed to lift this stuff. So the principal civilizations of the Neolithic, um, there were four, and we're only going to talk about two. Um, by and large, in this class, especially with the very brief time we have together for it being summer and all, um, we will ignore most of the East. Every once in a while I'll bring it up, but the book doesn't cover it very much, and we just don't have time to delve into it as much as it would be enjoyable to do so. So the Indus Ganges and the Ella River, these we're not going to talk about, but we will talk about the Tigris Euphrates and the Nile. So the Tigris Euphrates is ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonia. The Nile is ancient Egypt. We'll start with Mesopotamia. The word Mesopotamia literally means the land between rivers. The rivers being the Euphrates, or well, it's usually said the opposite, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. Notice the green is intended to indicate sort of fertility of the land, essentially, that most of this, as you probably know from current geopolitical events, is desert. Saudi Arabia, um, much of the eastern part of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, largely desert. So, not what's called arid land, which means that you can grow crops in it. But when you have water, um, and obviously these are not the only bodies of water, they're just the largest bodies of water, you have something more akin to what you're used to seeing around where you live, which is trees, plants, grasslands for animals, etc. So that's what you see when you see these green indications. Now notice these are pretty large swaths of land, so it's very simplistic in the way that it's been um, portrayed. One thing, real quick, to note on the map, just so you're aware of this, uh, when you're talking about thousands and thousands of years, um, it's easy to forget, but geology changes. So this interesting thing about this map is it notes the modern day coastline. Uh, this is how far the Persian Gulf penetrated into this place back during the time period we're talking about in Mesopotamia. So which is one of the principal cities we'll discuss, was on the Gulf, whereas now it's very, very far inland. The river, the Euphrates, that it was on has changed course, and now it looks perfectly uninhabitable. Um, so keep in mind, large time periods, things do change. To give you some perspective, I always like to kind of remind people uh, when you were learning American history, which inevitably you did either at Gainesville or in high school or even middle school or elementary school, you probably learned that the United States, if you happen to have gone to school in this country, or even if you didn't, was formed in 1776. So when we talk about the Revolutionary War in 1776, and the fact that people were riding horses and using wagons and didn't even have technology as advanced as telegraph yet, um, that was, 250 years ago. We're talking about time periods of thousands of years. So a lot changes very quickly, is my point. Um, and it's hard for us to really grasp how vast those time periods are. But 250 years is 1/4 of 1,000 years. So that should give you some idea of how little of a time period we are really used to thinking about. So, transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze and Iron Age. Agriculture has begun to provide an efficient and stable food source. People are still afraid and nervous about things going wrong with food, but for the most part, especially the civilizations along rivers, can control water by irrigation, etc. Food becomes more stable. As a result, fewer people are needed, way more still than today, but fewer people are needed for growing food. For safety and comfort, people congregate into larger cities, and social structure begins to develop, and you get a specialization and division of labor. So, for example, the person who made that beaker um, from Susa in Iran in 5000, 4000 BCE probably also grew his or her own food or participated with their family in growing their food. Um, as you start to get development of stratification within societies, in this time period, as we get into the Bronze and Iron Age, you get specialization. So you'll have groups of people who all they do is make pottery, and then they would trade pottery for their food, if that makes sense. I mean, it's what we do, right? I mean, if your job is, I don't know what your job might be. If you're, for example, a teacher, or you sell heavy equipment. You probably don't grow any food. You trade that what you do for money, and then you use the money to buy food. So specialization and division of labor. It's much more specialized and divided now than it was then, but you start to see it already, especially as you get into the Bronze and Iron Age. One of the earliest examples of an architectural monument or a temple that you have is the ziggurat. This is a specific ziggurat in which this is obviously just a drawing of it. It has been reconstructed. That's the picture of it here, but not the top of it. There's another little section on the top. And to give you an idea of scale, these are people. This is before the reconstruction, clearly, but it's big. It's not huge, but it's big. And so this is a person standing right on top of it. So, if you're more of a numbers person, then this will give you a better idea. It's 140 by 200 feet by 80 feet tall. This particular ziggurat was built, for the primary purpose of worshiping a moon goddess called Nana. That was important to early Mesopotamia. Things about Mesopotamian culture that we should note, which generally remain true of almost every culture we talk about up until 200 or 300 years ago, is Mesopotamian culture. They have a king and a queen. They are polytheistic. That has changed more recently, but we'll talk about what that means. They value the acquisition of land and people, and by that I mean there are groups of people, there are civilizations, there are cities that aren't necessarily under this particular king and queen. And for economic reasons and for all kinds of other reasons, this king and or queen wish to have more land and more people. And the easiest way to do that is through war. We'll talk about that. So, and as you get these divisions of labor and more stable society and specializations, you get developments of art. So you get more and more sculpture and pottery. You get architecture like the ziggurat of and you get music and you get writing. So, and we'll talk about some examples of those. But the sculpture and the pottery are the things that we still have that express or tell us a lot about the history of these different groups of people. Now, no one ever called themselves Mesopotamia. Okay, so I mean there were Akkadians and Babylonians and all sorts of other names that we know from history. We're just speaking very broadly here at this point. This is what's called the Royal Standard of It's made up of two parts, the front and the back. The front is called war, and the back is called peace. So we'll look at war first. This is Sumerian. Sumerian is one of the oldest Mesopotamian cultures that we know of, especially based in and around This is from a tomb in 779. So, all right, this becomes important. The date of this standard of of this it's a piece of pottery painted, is when it was made, which is 2600 BCE. When it says from tomb 779, that's not the date, that's the number of the tomb from archaeological research or digging. Okay, so, all right, this was found in which is in Iraq. The medium is shell, lapis lazuli, which is a type of stone, red limestone, which is also a type of stone, and it's originally on a wooden framework. So it's not very big, 8 inches by 19 inches. So you can imagine sort of taking a piece of wood and started inlaying shells and lapis lazuli, which is the bluer stuff, and red limestone, which is obviously the red stuff, and sort of building up this design. And you can see a lot of it has deteriorated. Um, but the primary interest in the Royal Standard of Ur is the historical story that it tells. Um, we'll talk about this in a minute, but this, for reasons of artistic depiction, which we call hieratic scale, is clearly the king. Although you can't exactly tell if this is a male or female, it's generally assumed to be a male. Um, and the hieratic scale means that he is more important than everyone else on this because he is the largest person on it. Doesn't mean he was literally the largest person, it just means he was the most important person. So this person is not necessarily more important than this person because they're larger, but this person is. And he breaks sort of the plane. If you notice this horizontal plane or border that's provided, he breaks it, so it makes him the king. But more importantly, in this piece of art, what you have happening is the king's people in chariots, so they have technology already akin to what we had, during the Revolutionary War. In four-wheel chariots driven by at least two horses, they're attacking and trampling and killing people. In this particular case, I don't know who the Sumerians are attacking, but they're killing most of the people. They're enslaving the rest of them, and then they're presenting the slaves to the king. So that's what happens in war. In peace, you have things also that you might expect, or are kind of what we do in a way. Again, you have the king. Notice he's sitting, but he's still larger than even the people that are standing. It's important he breaks this plane, so hieratic scale. Um, Here we have people that are presumably weaving, making clothing. We have people making music. We have people, with lambs or goats, so they're growing food. Growing food here is more like the harvest. Um, More music. Okay, so we're doing peace represents a time for um, growing food and making art, if you want to call some of this stuff art. So, uh, war and peace. Now, of course, they didn't call it War and Peace. That's the title we've provided, but this is the Royal Standard of Ur. Hieratic scale. Most important figures are depicted as larger than the others. There's a narrative, a story. I've already kind of gone through that. Um, One question that we kind of have to ask, because it remains the primary topic or story of almost all the art that we encounter for the next several thousand years, is when did war become the most important part of history? I'm not sure it ever became the most important part of history, but it was always the most commemorated part of history. And as a result, similar to what I said about religion being important to people, it was commemorated in ways that have lasted, that have uh, managed to stand the test of time and not eroded or rotted or um, been broken to pieces. So we pick, we put together, we piece together a lot of what we know about the history of peoples thousands of years ago by what's left over, and most of that has to do with war. Good or bad, that is the case. There are exceptions. This would be an interesting one. It's called the Stele, Stele, Stele of Hammurabi. Um, the Stele of Hammurabi is Babylonian, which is a culture that came right after the Sumerians, historically speaking. Uh, this is a stele is sort of like a plaque that's erected, and this particular one is made out of a type of stone called diorite, um, and it's 7 feet high, and it's an example of relief sculpture. Relief sculpture is sort of the distinction between sculpture that is etched out of stone, but only partially, versus the Venus of Willendorf, which is a full sculpture, right? You can pick it up and hold it and turn it around and look at all sides of it. This is a relief in that it is, you can't do that. This is what's presented to you is what you see, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about this difference between relief sculpture and sculpture more, especially when you do your photos. But for now, that's enough. The Stele of Hammurabi. So again, we don't know who erected or who made this. Correct? We don't know the artist, and so what we would say is that the artist is Babylonian, just like with the standard of Sorry, go back, look at that. With the royal standard of we would say that the artist is Sumerian, because again, this far back, we don't know who actually made these works of art. This dates from 1760 BCE, so still a very long time ago. This is writing. It's in cuneiform in Babylonian, so we can't read it. I mean, historians can. I suppose you might know how to, but most people can't read it. I can't read it. And what it is their laws. So, so to back up, cuneiform is a script made of that's not right, sorry, wedge-shaped characters pushed into soft clay, which then hardens into stone. So what they would do is they would take, if you know anything about the way that clay is made into pottery, is clay is essentially kind of like a mud, like a dirt, and it's very soft. And they would form these into little paper-sized dimensions, obviously much thicker. And while they are soft, they would push these little tools into them, and they, excuse me, kind of like typesetting, and they were different shapes, and the different shapes were different letters, just like we use letters for words. And then they would fire that, and it would harden into stone. So that's how they did that. The Stele of Hammurabi is carved because diorite is much harder than clay, but it would have been a similar concept. The Babylonians worshipped a sun god named Shamash, and in the Stele of Hammurabi, Shamash is endowing Hammurabi with his power. What that means is the power, the authority, which is the important word, the authority that Hammurabi has comes from the sun god. Now, which one of these is sun god? Notice they're basically the same height, but the difference is this person is sitting. So the more important person, in this case a god, is the larger person. So you kind of have to use your imagination. If Shamash were to stand up, he would be much taller than Hammurabi. So the sitting figure is the god. He is endowing Hammurabi with his power, which gives Hammurabi the authority to make that even more set in stone, if you will. Hammurabi is even considered a minor god, so he has the authority. In this particular case, the most important thing is he has the authority to write laws. So Hammurabi, in the Stele of Hammurabi, is communicating the laws of the nation. These are specific codes, and historically we know that the Stele of Hammurabi was erected in the middle of Ur, which was the largest city. It had been the largest Sumerian city and had been taken over by Babylon or Babylonia. And they come in and they're saying, okay, here are the laws. If you don't follow these laws, then there will be serious consequences. And just so everybody knows them, we're going to erect this stele in the middle of the city so you can come and read them, which is interesting. It tells us a lot about uh, their concept of ethics and truth, and the importance of law and order, and even things like um, literacy rates. Does that mean that everyone could read? It seems to suggest they could. So, Stele of Hammurabi. Another work of art that we have from this time period, which is typically considered the first written work of art, is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the oldest known story from about 2700 BCE. It was written as a poem in Akkadian cuneiform. So cuneiform took on several different languages. Akkadian was the one in which Epic of Gilgamesh was written. It's known as an epic. It includes disagreement with the gods, fighting the gods, seeking immortality, and also the oldest evidence of what's called the Great Flood, which many consider reminiscent of Noah's flood from the Old Testament and the Bible. And then it's also about death. There's several examples given in the textbook. I strongly suggest you read through them, simply because you will see how foreign the idea of the writing is, in addition to getting a good sense of what's going on in the minds of the people at this time period. Not all that different from our concerns. We're concerned about death, what death will bring, trying to avoid death. In Gilgamesh's particular example, it's by seeking out a flower of immortality. In our particular case, it's by maybe eating right, exercising, going to the doctor, not doing things we know that will bring an early death, etc. So there's disagreement with the gods, which is interesting, simply because you have a sense from the Stele of Hammurabi that most people lived in great fear of gods and kings. Here you have a little bit different portrayal of that. And then you have some overlap with a Hebrew culture, which we're going to talk about now as sort of a transition into Egypt. But the Great Flood there's not a whole lot of places, as you can imagine, that historically record a flood. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is one. The story from the Bible is another. And there's, I think, at least one other example. But since the flood was intended to kill all but a few people, it's not unusual to imagine there wouldn't be much evidence of it. So, the thing to remember about pretty much every culture we talk about, other than the Hebrew culture, until we get to around 200 BCE, is that the Hebrews were monotheistic, and we'll talk about the distinction between monotheistic and polytheistic. So that means that the Mesopotamians are polytheistic, the Egyptians are polytheistic, the Sumerians are polytheistic, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, etc. are polytheistic. Sorry, voice is getting tired. So the Hebrews are a Semitic people, most likely a tribe arising out of Mesopotamia. According to the Torah, which is just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the book Genesis, Abraham, who's sort of the beginning of the Jews or the Hebrews, was living in Ur when God called him to leave Ur for Canaan around 2000 BCE. So Abraham, Ur, the Hebrews, they go to Canaan as a monotheistic people, as I talked about already, in 1600 BCE. So Abraham is dead, but his descendants, there's a bad drought that lasts for many years. And in order to get food, the Hebrews go down to Egypt. This is all told in the book of Genesis, a very elaborate story about how it occurs. But ultimately, in 1300 BCE, the Hebrews are enslaved by the Egyptians. So um, the Exodus, the story of the freeing of the Hebrews from the Egyptians, which was told in the Bible by the book of Exodus and was a movie that recently came out, or the most recent version recently came out. It's been the topic of several movies. Um, is an important event for Jews today. It's an important event for Christians today. It's an important event for Muslims today, um, and it's told extensively in the Bible itself. But we use it as a transition because it's widely understood that many of the artistic and architectural achievements of the Egyptians were actually accomplished by their slaves, a significant portion of which would have been the Hebrews at this particular time period. Obviously, Egypt is a country that exists today. It's the first time we've encountered a country really that exists today. Um, the climax or the high point of the Egyptian civilization was from 3000 BCE to 1000 CE. Notice now we've transitioned from um, before the Common Era into the Common Era. So 1000 CE was 1015 years ago. This is also the first time we've encountered a culture that really spans that change in time. If you haven't picked up on this and you didn't already know, everything from zero back is in negative numbers. So, for example, 24,000 BCE is a lot longer ago than 3000 BCE. So it's almost like you could read it as negative 24,000 BCE. And then it counts down to zero, and then starts back up. So from zero, we're now in 2015 CE. I hope that makes sense. If you don't quite get it, send me an email or ask me a question in next class. The Egyptians see some extensive developments in the arts, architecture. They're obviously, Egyptians are known for more than anything for their pyramids and their sculpture and their funerary rites and a lot of things we'll talk about. Literature. They had extensive written myths. The Babylonians had extensive writing, but didn't even come close to how elaborate and extensive the Egyptians get. There's these sculptures and what we call palettes, which are similar to steels but on much smaller scales, so they've got a different name. But this is Egypt. If you remember from the map a long time ago, we were talking about the Nile River. And if you also remember, the green, fertile areas sort of closely follow the Nile River. So an interesting thing about the Nile River, which I would trick everyone on and ask a really ingenious question about if we were in class, is which direction does the Nile River flow? As we look at a map, it makes sense that the Nile River would flow this way, but in fact it does not. The Nile River, as most rivers, flows into the ocean. So it flows from Lake Nasser down in Sudan and southern Egypt into northern or upper Egypt. And the Nile River seasonally floods. And the floods are very predictable in terms of when they occur. And because this is fresh water, the predictability of the flooding of the Nile allowed the excavation of extensive irrigation ditches, which allowed for extensive farming, and is excuse me, the primary reason that Egypt basically became such a stable, prominent, large civilization was because they had a very reliable source of food and it never depended on rain, or not very often. Um, so, uh, unlike the Hebrews who were up in Israel, um, who relied upon rain to grow food and have pasture land for their animals, the Egyptians did not, and that's why the Hebrews eventually first they just come down to get some food, and they take it back, thinking the drought will be over. Um, but when it's not over, they end up sort of migrating here. The Egyptians welcome them by and large, but then ultimately enslave them, which is not that surprising, really. Unlike cuneiform, the Egyptians used a form of writing called hieroglyphics or hieroglyphs. Um, they like to call this the writing of the gods. It's what we call picture writing. It's combinations of symbols and letters. Um, there were 700 to 5,000 characters that developed over time. This is sort of an example of hieroglyphs. So when archaeologists read hieroglyphs, they have a number of options. When, for example, they see something like this carved into stone, it could be the letter H, it could be the word wick, and then there's actually, in other examples like here, it could be a number. There's a lot of different options, but I suppose as they understand that more and more, they're able to distinguish exactly whether it's a letter or a symbol. Um, the closest equivalent to today, is really Chinese, which is a picture writing. They are primarily symbolic. Japanese started off kind of like that, but has begun to tend more towards the letters with the symbols. So, but most languages today use letters or an alphabet. Not the same, obviously, but a different kinds of alphabets. Um, the pyramids, I'm sure that most of you have seen pictures of these. Maybe you've seen them in person. This is kind of what they look like today. This is an artist's depiction of maybe what they looked like back then. Excuse me. Notice that the tops of these are gilded with gold. That's long gone. The most unusual feature of the pyramids is the architectural challenge of building something that is this shape. Not to mention the scale and the size of these. Obviously, this is a person. These are basically like built mountains, quite large. Um, Similar to ziggurats, but certainly more architecturally advanced. The main difference architecturally being that a ziggurat is stepped, whereas a pyramid it originally at least had very smooth sides. Also very different in their purpose. The ziggurat was used for religious worship reasons. Like I mentioned, the ziggurat in Ur was used for the worship of Nana, the moon goddess. There were people buried in ziggurats, but primarily, they were used for worship. The opposite is true of pyramids. There might have been some worship, but primarily they were used for tombs, for burial. This is called the Palette of Narmer. There is a MyArts lab for doing this, for learning more about the Palette of Narmer. So we won't go into a great deal of detail. I just want to sort of beat a dead horse here, as we say in the South, and tell you exactly how to read these different pieces of art. So, artist is the culture, which is Egyptian in this case. The title, Palette of Narmer. It is from Hyrcanopolis Dynasty, which is a time period from 3000 BCE. Is located in Egypt. Notice here it tells you the museum it's located in. And the stone, it's a type of stone called schist. I don't know how you pronounce it actually. Maybe maybe schist, I don't know. And it's 25 1/4 inches high. There's two sides to the palette of Narmer. Um, Notice the hieratic scale. Clearly, this is the king. He's larger than anyone else. He's subjugating someone or other. Again, subjugation, death. These are words, symbols, telling us about the palette of Narmer. Again, you'll see that in the My Arts Lab. Um, More sort of depiction of what is going on during this time period, subjugation, death, um, and then this little idealistic, or not idealistic, sorry, this non-naturalistic depiction of lions forms. Usually, it's understood as a receptacle for putting eye makeup. If you've seen the new Exodus or you've seen any old Exodus movies, you'll notice that they use a lot of eye makeup, so it was pretty important to them. This is probably the most elaborate and well-preserved piece of Egyptian art piece of art that we've encountered thus far. Um, the funerary mask of Tutankhamun. Um, this is gold, which of course we recognize as being very valuable. Most people would have. It's very realistic. You can see the eye makeup, the inlays of glass and semi-precious stones. I think that this was recently in the news because they were cleaning it, and I think they broke off the beard, which of course is not good. I assume they were able to paste it back or something. But the funerary mask of Tutankhamun is typically kind of held up as one of the more beautiful, lasting pieces of art from Egyptian time period. There were lots of sculpture and statuary and architecture that we don't even begin to have time to discuss in this class, but we'll compare some of the statuary to the Greeks as we start talking about Greek sculpture next week. All right. Hopefully you've broken this up and looked at it and thought about it over a little bit more time than it has taken me to do it, because my voice is worn out. So I will upload this to YouTube because that'll make it a lot easier to access, which will take a few minutes, and then I'll upload the link to Angel. All right, thanks a lot. I look forward to meeting everybody next week. Let me know if you have any questions then. Thanks.